Good afternoon, students. I'm now speaking to you again in my study. Uh, what I want to do today is go through certain chapters of the Odyssey so that you will be more comfortable as we go into the second, shall we say, major exam, which likely will come next week. As you see, we're in a kind of rapid way finishing school. There'll be one more work we'll read for the semester, and then we will draw conclusions. It's been very fast. Again, as we've said, very hard on both of us. And I will give you some further instructions when I give the second lecture, uh, probably later this weekend, like maybe on Sunday. So when you get an opportunity and you see that this one is posted, go ahead and start viewing it. I've already talked to you in a sense about the first four books. I've explained the significance of the four. And what I want to do now is actually go through, begin with the second section of the Odyssey and call your attention to the importance of several chapters in this second section. So I start, and what I'm doing is to use my prose translation, but those of you who are using the anthology, and you see that the Odyssey in the anthology is in poetic form, the line references are going to be very similar. So I'll give you an approximate line reference in regard to the various books or chapters, and I think you can find or pick up very easily where I am. So I begin by looking at chapter 5, which to me is very important for a number of reasons. One thing I need to get across to you is that we have to have an understanding of why Odysseus wants to get back home. One obvious reason is after 20 years, and particularly the last 10 years, he's very tired of wandering. He's been doing this, and while he's had some excitements and he's encountered some new experiences, we have to take into account now. He's not getting any younger. Remember, he's been gone 20 years. So he's thinking it's about time for me to go home. I want to reestablish with my family. And another reason, he hasn't had this opportunity yet, he thinks, to fulfill his expectations and his needs as this hero. All right, he will be in actually for a number of surprises. So as you look at book 5, it's entitled appropriately Calypso. Now, part of a stage of his voyage, or I would simply say a stage of Odysseus' voyage, is marked by his encounters with women. And Calypso is one. Now, what they have in common is this. At first, they may present a kind of challenge to him, but then a little bit later, they're going to offer a kind of assistance to him. Now, there are 3 chapters in this regard that make up what I call a kind of utopian experience. And the 3 chapters are with Calypso, and then he will spend time with the Phaeacians, and then he will recollect his adventure with Circe. Now, when I say the utopian experience, this is his opportunity to experience a society that is very new to him. It's almost a kind of ideal place. So with that thought in mind, I would call your attention as I look into my text about line 60. And remember now, I'm in book 5, and I'll read a couple of lines. And as I said, there may be a difference, obviously, in translations, but you'll see that there's enough of a significance that you can follow. It says, he found her at home. A large fire was blazing on the hearth, and the scent from burning logs of Jupiter. Now, I would like for you to look in terms of that paragraph. And the notion is, as you look at that paragraph, That is a most apt description of her dwelling. And I think for all purposes, if you look at it most carefully, it does suggest the ideal. So read several of the descriptive phrases here. And the last line, which would be about, oh, shall I say about line 72, it was indeed a spot where even an immortal visitor might pause to gaze in wonder and delight. Now, in reading the chapter, you know for all purposes that Hermes has come and he has, by Zeus, has instructed to Calypso that it's time for Odysseus to get back home. Now, she hasn't exactly kept him against his will. He's actually enjoyed, I think for the most part, his stay with her. Now, their relationship is very much based on a kind of physical attraction. And you might say, our hero from the Trojan War, look what he's doing here. For this period of time that he's been with Calypso, it's almost as though he's been a kind of kept man. And so what I think a good insight for me to convey to you, I don't want you to just read and say, well, the gods have decided it's time for Odysseus to get back home. Part of what, if we're going to form and delineate Odysseus' character, part of what I've got to call your attention to here is he, at this juncture, has regained back what I call his power of choice. He has made up his own mind that he wants to go back home. He's going to reject, if you will, some of the temptations of the ideal world. And look, what he wants to do is to embrace the challenges of the real world. Living with Calypso, there's not much of a challenge here. All he has to do, in a sense, is to clearly satisfy her so-called physical needs. Now, you can imagine human nature. We can almost get too much of a good thing. In other words, we lose a little bit of the sense of expectation. We lose a bit of anticipation. Can you imagine? Some would say, my gosh, I would hate to give up this life. And actually, I've thought of it myself. This is pretty ideal. But think about it. Day after day, he's going to get up and walk the beaches, roaming about. Now, she's going to take care of every aspect of his needs. All right. It's almost as though, and what we have to take into account with Calypso, he's a kind of an appendage. She's number one. He follows behind her. So, really, for all purposes, this might be a kind of an affront to his ego. So, at any rate, the notion is that he is determined to leave. I repeat to you, he has regained back his power of choice. So I will now reference about line 200. Look at as she speaks here. She says, so you're determined, son of Laertes, favorite of Zeus, to leave at once for home and your beloved Ithaca. She's probably not entirely gracious here. Look at her line, even so I wish you happiness. Well, might be a note of sarcasm there. But if you read down a little bit, it reads, had you any inkling of the full measure of misery you're bound to endure? Endurance is going to be one of the qualities that Odysseus will learn to adopt, and it's going to be one of the ways that he will get back home safely. And she says, Just think about, excuse me, about what's about to happen to you. And look what she offers him. It's a kind of bribe, I would have to say. She says, "You would stay here and share this home with me and take on immortality, however much you long to see that wife of yours." And Calypso is most aware. She says, "Who is never out of your thoughts." And what she says here is true. "And yet I claim to be by no means her inferior in looks or figure, for surely it would be most unseemly for a woman to compete with the goddess in form and face." So she's saying, look, you're going to go home. And remember, I keep reminding you, the passage of time. Odysseus has aged, so has Penelope. Now think about this offer. You will never have to worry about anything again. And I'm giving you immortality. All right. Now, think about when we looked at the Iliad. Remember some of the offers that Agamemnon made to Achilles. So Odysseus is going to answer. And again, he says, "Nevertheless, I long to reach my home and see the day of my return." I think that's going to be a very important theme in terms of the Odyssey. The idea is he wants to return. I think I used the word in one of my videos, Nostos. He wants to return back to his place of origin. When I use the word return, I don't mean he's interested in going right now on another adventure. What he wants to do is return back to that place that he has left. It is my never failing wish. So he says, I am prepared to accept all of the disasters that may befall me. Well, she understands now that it's time for him to leave. So if you look about line 260, notice here, he must establish his identity. So it says, by the end of the fourth day, all his work was done, and on the fifth, the goddess saw him off from the island. She bathed him first and dressed him in sweet-smelling clothes. Remember, I explained to you this idea of bath as a kind of really purification ritual. Bath is the symbol of, the idea is that he's going to undergo, if you will, a new experience. Now, the experience that he's about to participate in is quite different from what he has had in terms of Calypso. All right. Now, here he will embrace a challenge. And I think for all purposes, this might be a beginning again. And I repeat again, because some things have already happened to him. It's a continuation, if you will, of physical suffering. Now, part of what must happen here is there is the imminent threat. Now remember, Calypso had offered him immortality. Now he's going to embrace the real world and all of its problems and all of its tribulations. So, the most obvious threat to him as he leaves their island, and I'm about line 300, I don't necessarily need to mark anything at this juncture, but read here and you'll get the essence of what I'm talking about. The most obvious threat is death by water. Now, the notion is, if he dies this way, I will go back and let you look at maybe about line 310. This is a very telling and revealing, I think, moment. So he says, if only I too could have met my fate and died the day the Trojan hordes let fly at me with their bronze spears over Achilles' corpse. I should at least have had my burial rites, excuse me, and the Achaeans would have spread my fame abroad. And this is a great line. But now it seems I was predestined to an ignoble death. See what would happen? Nobody would even acknowledge the fact that he was this great hero. In other words, he would die unrecognized, unseen. So he's going to be the most determined to get back home. Now, as you finish the chapter, part of what must happen to him is that he's got to survive. And the way that he's going to survive is to call up some of his own instincts. So this is what you're going to find, if you will, at the end of the chapter. Now go to the next chapter, which is chapter 6. And in my text, now, as far as his identity, I want to get across to you that he's assuming the identity of a wanderer. He's going to go to the land of the Phaeacians. And remember, in my last, I suppose, video, I explained to you that he must undergo 3 phases before he can return home. You remember one of the phases that he had to, in a sense, forget his past. The idea is he had to forget about the Trojan War, and he's left now Calypso behind. He now enters into this phase, what I have called the rite of transition. His stay with the Phaeacians, which is important, bridges the gap between the real world and the unreal world. I think for all purposes, this probably is, and again, this is another exercise in utopian living. Very important that you see this. Now, he will arrive at the land of the Phaeacians, and about line 15, he has learned by now to keep his identity. He's not going to reveal his identity. He's, in a sense, what he's going to do is to suppress his identity. Now, there's a name I want you to get as you begin chapter 6, about line 15. The king of the Phaeacians is named Alcinous, and his daughter is Nausicaa. And as you read in that chapter, you see an apt description of her. Now, what's going to happen here is, as she sees this stranger, she, in a sense, is going to fall for him. There will be a kind of physical attraction, but Odysseus, it's not going to be the attraction that he has had for Calypso. This never will come to any kind of physical fulfillment. Now, the test for Odysseus is not to succumb to temptation that Nausicaa, in a sense, may put upon him. Now, it's going to take several chapters, in a sense, for Odysseus to stay with the Phaeacians and to embrace their society. So, if you'll go to chapter 7, for all purposes, I would like to call your attention to about line 110. This is another apt description of why this society, I think, is an example of a utopian moment. It reads, just to get you started, just outside the entrance to the courtyard, surrounded by a wall, lies a large orchard of 4 acres, pears and pomegranates, apple trees, and so forth. And then if you continue in the next paragraph, it says, in the same enclosure, there's a fruitful vineyard. Look at the description there. Now, what I want to get across to you as you read here, I think the Phaeacians very much represent the best of the ideal world, as well as reaching, in a sense, in a kind of telling sense, aspects of the real world. Now look, this description of the Phaeacian society differs from the description of Calypso's dwelling. What must happen here is, as you look further down, maybe about line 130, in the garden are two springs. One flows in channels to all parts of it. And then I'll read where it says, first provides a watering place for the townspeople, and then runs under the courtyard gate towards the great house itself. Such were the glorious gifts the gods had bestowed on Alcinous's home. All right, the point I want to make it to you here is the gods may have favored the Phaeacians to some extent, but very importantly, they are going to let this society begin. But then they're going to step away, and it's up to the Phaeacians to put forth the effort to make sure. In other words, what I want you to see here, in a sense, is in order for this society to grow, the Phaeacians themselves must have what I call a sense of the work ethic. They have got to work at what the gods had initially given to them. So I think to me, it would be a very tempting moment. Look what he could do. He could just stay here for all purposes. You remember what the king is going to do. He says, for all purposes, stay here. In time, marry my daughter. You can actually become king at a given time yourself, perhaps. All right. And just think, Odysseus wants to go back to Ithaca, but there he's got to deal with some unknown circumstances. Now, if you go to chapter 8, it's entitled The Phaeacian Games. Odysseus is not going to spend any time participating, so we're going to go through several pages here. And one of the most important aspects of the chapter will come about. They're going to engage in the art of storytelling, and there will be mention brought up about the Trojan War. This, in a sense, is going to make Odysseus obviously somewhat nostalgic. He's going to think, in a sense, about his past. That's important. Remember, if I'm telling you that he's experiencing what is called the rite of transition, the idea, he has to, in a sense, think about his past life. We've got to put a period to that. He can't return to that. That's all over. Now, another choice for him is he could stay here and I think be happy, perfectly well be happy, or in a sense, he will look what he considers to be the future, and the future lies somewhere else. He does not have to stay here. In time, he may think this is not going to be much of a challenge itself. In other words, if it takes on certain characteristics of the utopian, remember, there won't be that much of a challenge. Now, go to chapter 9, and you're going to deal with the recalling of some of the adventures. Now, what I want you to remember particularly is this. Remember in my last video I explained to you that in order, you see, if this is, again, I repeat, the skill of Homer, Odysseus has participated in some 8, 9, 10 adventures. Well, if Homer were to begin the work with Odysseus experiencing each adventure, the Odyssey would never finish. So what you have to take into account is this idea of literary economy. For all purposes, these past adventures he's already experienced them. Now, I explained to you the importance of flashback. What he's going to do, the Phaeacians are interested, and remember, he has not revealed his identity until this moment. They have put no pressure on him. I think that an interesting insight into the king of the Phaeacians is that he likely has figured out who Odysseus is, but he doesn't pressure him. When Odysseus is ready, Odysseus will reveal his identity, and this is what you're finding in Book 9, about line 20. He acknowledges who he is. Now, what it amounts to, he becomes a participant in his own narrative. And remember, I had explained to you that we're going to look now at a series of episodes and in the adventures. And in each episode, Odysseus is the principal character for all purposes. Now, let's look at a little bit, and I'll read just a little bit here in terms of chapter 9. Remember, he's going to recall his past through flashback. He says, I am Odysseus, Laertes' son. The whole world talks of my stratagems, and my fame has reached the heavens. My home is under the clear skies of Ithaca. Now you can continue reading here. And let's get one of our first adventures. And as I move so I can see in terms of my text, my reference to you here will be about line 40. All right, they're on their way home, and it says, the same wind that wafted me from Ilium brought me to Ismarus, the city of the Cyclones. This is one of the very, very early adventures. Look how it reads. I sacked this place and destroyed its menfolk. The women and the vast plunder that we took from the town we divided so that no one, as far as I could help it, should go short of his proper share. All right. He has not forgotten the experience of what he encountered in the Trojan War. They're on their way home, and they just happen upon the city of the Cyclones. And look what happens here. He has this so-called war mentality. He sacks their city, plunders them, and then he goes on. So see, he's got to change in the course of the work. Now, imagine he's reflecting upon this moment as he's talking to the Phaeacians. All right, so part of what must happen too that I must get across to you in the adventure section is time after time, Odysseus has got to lose some of his men, some of these men who have survived the Trojan War with him. You understand that when Odysseus gets back home in book or chapter 13, he's alone. So gradually in these adventures, he's going to lose some of his men. It says about line 60, 6 of my strong comrades from each ship were killed. The rest of us eluded our fate and got away alive. So, pretty good learning moment here. Now, I'm going to move into the chapter and go to about line 85. Now, you have to take into account, remember, there's always this threat of death by sea. So, it says, for 9 days, I was chased by those accursed winds across the teeming seas. All right. Now, as you read here, it says, but on the 10th, we reached the country of the lotus eaters, a race that eat the flowery lotus fruit. All right. Now, here's your temptation. Does Odysseus partake of eating the lotus fruit? Now notice the impact. When we had eaten and drunk, I sent some of my followers inland to find out what sort of human beings might be there. Off they went, and it was not long before they came upon the lotus eaters. Now, these natives had no intention of killing my comrades. What they did was to give them some lotus to taste. And look what it's going to do to them. All right. Now, that's most important here. In order to get them back, see, the idea is you eat the lotus fruit. Come on, people. They're going to gain a kind of perpetual high. All right. I always like to put it this way. And here's your lesson on drugs. Say no to drugs. The test is for Odysseus. Does he partake of the lotus fruit? Well, gosh, people, if he did, see how these adventures are somewhat told in a kind of progressive order. Just think, if he partook of the lotus fruit, I think for all purposes, it might have this impact upon him. It might have this influence upon him. I think it could dull his senses, his mind, would block, in a sense, clear thinking. Well, how, for all purposes, do you think that he would behave with the Cyclops? See? So, I think that's part of it. So, the idea is, he says, no, we're going to go on. Probably, I think if you read into it, likely some of his men chose to stay behind. Now, what you're finding out in some of these adventures, my gosh, they might be nothing more than a couple of paragraphs. But when you get to the next one, which will be about line 105, it says, so we left that country and sailed with heavy hearts, and we came to the land of the Cyclops, a fierce, lawless people who never lift a hand to plant or plow, but just leave everything to the mortal gods. All the crops they require spring up unsown and untilled. Wheat and barley and vines with generous clusters that swell with the rain from heaven to yield wine. Now look what I'm reading for you. The Cyclops have no assemblies for the making of laws, nor any established legal codes, but live in hollow caves in the mountain heights. All right, a good word. And it says, each man is lawgiver to his own children and women, and nobody has the slightest interest in what his neighbors decide. Now, why don't you do this? Why don't you look upon a good comparison? We look at the Cyclops, compare the Cyclops to the Phaeacians. To me, the Cyclops represent an anti-utopian society. All right. Now, they mean to do physical harm, if you will, to Odysseus. Now, some always ask the question, why does this adventure take as long as it does? Well, it's a very simple explanation. This adventure takes as long as it does for this reason. Can you imagine? We've just come off of what has happened with the lotus eaters, and Odysseus was to say, no, I'm not doing this. I don't want to partake of the lotus fruit. Now, this is one adventure that he thinks will make him look good. All right, look how he uses his talent. Look how he's going to use his mind. Hey, the Cyclops can't be any kind they present no challenge to him. It's a good instance of mind over force. They can defeat him easily physically, but his mind initially will defeat them. Now you can read in the narrative yourselves. You remember what's going to happen in terms of what the Cyclops will do. You read all about the cave and how Odysseus and his men are imprisoned, so as to speak. The boulder is placed where they can't get out, and so forth. Now, I want to go to about line 365, and notice what Odysseus, in a sense, has learned. he talks to the Cyclops and he says, Cyclops, I said, you ask me my name. I'll tell it to you. And in return, give me the gift you promised me. My name is nobody. That's so important. This is what I am called by my mother and father, and by all my friends. It's very important. He really, right now, is a nobody figure. All right? Now, part of what has to happen, see, he's going to be a nobody initially when he gets back home. See, I keep reiterating the fact for you that he has got to establish his identity. So I think there's an irony there. Now, you know for all purposes how he's going to defeat the Cyclops. All right, perfect. It's an excellent narrative. Probably the Phaeacians are enjoying this story very much. All right, now what I want you to do, go into the text a little bit more and go to about line 500. And I'm going to make an important point here for you. Now, remember they're trying to escape the Cyclops. And once the Cyclops gets out of the cave, you understand that he has blinded the Cyclops. And for all purposes, remember the Cyclops is going to pick up boulders and try to attack them as they're making their way to their ships. Go to about line 500 and look how it reads. But my temper was up. Their words did not dissuade me. And in my rage, very important here, I shouted back at him once more. Now, they're no longer in harm's way, so as to speak. Cyclops, if anyone ever asks you how you came by your blindness, tell him how your eye was put out by Odysseus. Look what he does. Sacker of cities. He's proud of the fact of what he has just done to the Cyclones. The son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca. Don't you see that pride there? That arrogance? Look, he tells everything, every vital profile or every aspect is given. He gives his phone number, his zip code, and whatever. Now, what I want to emphasize for you is this. You can't blame the gods and say the gods did this. The gods didn't do this. Man does this. So part of what you have to understand here is he's got to bear, if you will, the responsibility. All right? No one said he had to stand up and say who he was. Now, I'd like to go into chapter 10 with you. And my reference to you here, the chapter is appropriately entitled, if you will, Circe. All right. Now, I get into the chapter, and my reference to you will be about line 30. It says, for 9 days and nights we sailed on, and on the 10th we were already in sight of our homeland. Hadn't even come near enough to see people tending their fires. And then look what happens when I fell fast asleep. Remember I told you that sleep is a destructive element in the adventures, but when we get to the return back home, it becomes restorative. All right, I was utterly exhausted. For my anxiety to speed our journey home, I handled the sheet of my ship myself without a break, giving it to no one else. I think he engages in a moment of excess here. All right. Now, I think an important point that I must make to you, or for you, is this. Look, what happens is things have been going fairly well for them. Look what they've just done. They've defeated the Cyclops, and part of life that we have, look, think about in a sense, today we can become too complacent we can become too content. And look what happens. So this is what I'm reading into it here. It says, remember they had been given the wind. It says from the wind god. And it says the crew began to discuss matters among themselves. And word went round that I was bringing home a fortune in gold and silver, which the great-hearted Aeolus had given me. Look at his men talking. Remember I told you it's very important that he will get rid of some of them. All right. Now, as I continue, look what they're saying. What a captain we have, valued wherever he goes and welcomed in every port. Back he comes from Troy with a splendid haul of plunder. And now Aeolus has given him all this into the bargain. Come on, let's find out and see how much gold and silver is hidden in that bag. Don't you see the theme here? Appearance and reality. Again, it's going to be a very utilitarian way for him to get rid of some of his men. They untied the bag. The winds all rushed out. In an instant, the tempest was upon them. Now look, they see home, but through their own actions, look what they did. But isn't it a good thing? They're not ready to go home yet. If Odysseus were to get back home right now, look what lies waiting for him. So he says, when I awoke, my spirit failed me. I debated within myself whether to jump overboard and drown or stay among the living. And quietly, there's that word again I had called your attention to once he left Calypso, endure. I stayed and endured. Covering my head with my cloak, I lay where I was in the ship. So all my ships with their distraught crew were driven back to the island of Aeolus. Gosh. Talking about suffering. Don't you see? For all purposes, look what's happened here. All right. Now, I hope by now you're beginning to form some idea of the importance of these adventures and their significance. Now, I'm going to conclude now. I've talked almost about 45 minutes, and I'd like to pick up next time, and I'm going to talk to you about his adventure with Circe, and then very importantly, probably one of the most important books in the Odyssey will be book 11. And that will be the Book of the Dead. Now, I've already told you to go ahead and read the Odyssey. And what I'm doing with you is to discuss some of the chapters and point out some. It's been a kind of textual analysis, sort of like we did in terms of the Iliad. And then by the time I finish my second video for you, I'll talk to you about the major exam over the Odyssey, which definitely will have to come next week. Also, I will talk to you and tell you what our last work will be. I want to teach one more work before we end the semester. So I'm going to stop here and bid you well. And then shortly, this video will be posted. And if you have an opportunity, please do view it. Have a good weekend. We'll talk later.